Good afternoon. I'm Joyce Barrett, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Webinars are typically a membership benefit of Heritage Ohio. This webinar is open to all as part of our efforts to support young preservation professionals. Heritage Ohio's mission is helping people to save the places that matter, build community, live better. We invite you to join Heritage Ohio by visiting our website. Today, our presentation is Building Your Career in a Changing Industry. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please type it into the question box at any time. Most issues with the webinar software will be solved if you close the program and restart it with the link that was sent to you. Tomorrow, we will send out the recording. If you would like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, please let me know by email. Our presenter today is Katie Rispoli Keaotamai. Katie is the founder and CEO of Tico. Katie has spent the last 7 years completing work that intersects with construction, historic preservation, urban planning, and placemaking. She is most well known for her work in construction management, having planned and overseen the relocation of the world's first Taco Bell, as well as a number of other public and residential buildings. Prior to becoming CEO of Tico, Katie served as executive director of We Are the Next, where she provided programs that introduced teens and young adults to cities in the built environment. She holds a BA in art history from California State University, Long Beach, and a master's of heritage conservation from the School of Architecture at the University of Southern California. With that, I will hand this presentation over to Katie, live from Long Beach, California.
Hi, Joyce, and everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here today and to dive into some really exciting content with all of you and give an overview that I hope will be really helpful. So I wanted to start today by just talking a little bit about my background, so you have an idea of who I am and how I got to the place where I am in the preservation profession today. So I am sort of your classic preservation story. I'll talk more about this later, but I'm one of those people who sort of found this profession on accident. I never really went to historic places as a kid. This is a very rare photo of me at a historic site on one of those classic 4th grade field trips to a California mission. But I didn't grow up in a family that visited museums. I didn't grow up in an area that had a strong culture around historic preservation, even though we did have quite an old building stock in Northern California, where I'm from. And I never knew that preservation was a profession. But I was really interested in history and pretty interested in architecture. And when I was 21 years old, I landed a coincidental job in construction, working with a local contractor. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just trying to. Okay. Sorry, I can't seem to switch slides now. We practiced this quite a bit, and for some reason now it's not working for me. But anyway, so I started working in construction when I was 21. And found myself working for a construction company that specialized in the renovation of historic buildings. And I personally was very interested in architecture and historic places. And so I sort of stumbled upon that as a career path. And it was only once I started working in construction that I discovered that historic preservation was an opportunity for me. Someone mentioned that you could get a degree in preservation, which I did not know was the case previously. Real quick, I'm going to
try double-clicking. Try double-clicking on that.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay. Thanks, Joyce. Sorry about that, everyone. So I, as a construction management professional, sort of began building my career working in that field, and discovered that I was often the youngest person in the room when I would go to preservation related events. I tried getting involved in the preservation community, and at one point even had a door slammed in my face at a historic house museum, simply because they were not interested in having a young person participate and shake up the culture and the community that had developed at that historic site. And frankly, I felt that it was important that we made young people feel more welcome in this profession, and I took it upon myself to try to find ways for that to happen. And that was when in 2014, I started We Are the Next, which Joyce mentioned, which was a nonprofit organization. And We Are the Next, our goal as an organization was to introduce young people to careers in historic preservation and other aligned professions like architecture and urban planning that had a direct impact on the cities that they lived in. And through this work, we hope to help young people understand that they, as residents in their communities, could end up playing a significant role in deciding how those communities got built and who lived in them and how their life played out in that built environment. And since over half of the world's population lives in cities, we focused on urban areas and helping young people understand how they could be advocates in those areas. But as I started working with young people, I started doing research to figure out how people get into these fields and how their careers develop over time. And some of that research I'm going to talk about today. And then that research really led me to talking with young professionals and those who were in the early stages of their career. And what we discovered was that, people did in fact discover these careers often by accident, which there needs to be more of an effort made to inform young people of career opportunities in our professions. But once they were in these professions, or once they started pursuing them, a lot of people felt that they weren't welcome or that they had challenges because there were so few opportunities for people to actually achieve a real career trajectory without a support system. So if you didn't already have connections in the field, it was very difficult to meet the people you needed to meet and to get set up for success. So that was why about a year ago, I formally started Tico, which is a for-profit company. I'll talk more about Tico, but essentially Tico offers an alternative to LinkedIn that is specific to our industry and makes it much easier for an incoming professional in a field like preservation to easily find and connect with people who share their interest in a wide variety of professions. So absolutely, over the last 7 years or so, I've made a strong effort to advocate for the next generation of professionals and to build infrastructure that makes it easier for them to lay a foundation for a successful career trajectory. So with all that said, I want to talk about career development. As part of what we're talking about today is just this concept of career development and how we actually engage with it as preservation professionals. So I think it's important to cover first what we are covering in this webinar and second what we're not. So first, what we're covering is just the general concept of career development in this field. So how can you get introduced to the profession, sort of lay the groundwork for getting engaged with the profession, access resources that help you to lay a successful foundation within the profession. What we're not going to be covering today is how preservation works on a more holistic level, the field as a whole, and some of the dynamics that play into the field and how preservation professionals in different sections sort of communicate with each other. And the reason we're not covering that is just because there's so much within the field of preservation. It is such a diverse and sort of sectioned off profession that to be able to talk about that content would require 3 or 4 times the length of time that we have today. So for today's purposes, we're really going to be talking about the foundational concept of career development in preservation. So to get us started, I want to talk about who are the players in these professions. Who are the people who shape the built environment? And when we talk about the built environment, we're talking about the environment that surrounds us that's created by humankind. So not necessarily the natural environment, even though the natural environment can be shaped by our activities relating to building the built environment. But generally, we're talking about roads and infrastructure, buildings, structures, and man-made features like man-made lakes, etc. So when we're talking about this, there are so many different players that come into play here. These are just a few, and on the right, you can see a more extended list of different professions that directly impact the things we build in our environment. There are other professionals that are not on this list that have a more intangible impact on these, and that those are professionals like accountants, demographers, economists, journalists. They all play an important role in this, but I'm specifically here talking about the people who physically develop policy and things that shape the built environment. So for the purposes of this presentation today, I'm going to be looking at 3 specific professions that you can see here at the bottom left. Those professions are, of course, historic preservation, architecture, and urban planning. And the reason I've selected architecture and urban planning as sort of the key 2 professions to contrast and compare us with is because those are the professions that we most often align with. So many professionals who work in historic preservation hold degrees in architecture or vice versa, or the same in urban planning. And there are quite a few dual degree programs where you can get both a master's degree in historic preservation and urban planning at the same time. You can do a specialization in one or the other as part of your degree program in one. And so because this relationship between these 3 fields is so closely entwined, we're going to be looking at the 3 of them over the course of this webinar. So let's start with the path to becoming an architect. I'm going to walk through the path in all 3 of these professions, and we're going to look at some of the key differences. So the key difference between architecture and urban planning and preservation is that in architecture, people know it exists ahead of time. So most people learn about architecture as a kid. Many of them are told that it's a career path. They hear about it in school when they're in science, physics, math classes. They hear about it from their parents. They see it on TV. I partially blame or credit, I guess, the Brady Bunch with a wide awareness of the field of architecture. And frankly, if that TV show had not come on when it did and followed a huge boom in mid-century architecture, I'm not sure that architecture would have the notoriety that it has today, as far as being a profession that many are aware of, but it is one. So many people learn about architecture before they do anything else. They intend to become architects when they go to college. So they start college either as a BS or a BA type student, and usually they earn a Bachelor's of Science in Architecture or a BArch, a Bachelor's in Architecture, from an accredited architecture school. So most of the time, that's how this gets started. Now, they often start by going into an internship. That's usually the first step for an architect. And these internships are pretty exploitive. So similarly to internships we hear about in fields like museums, historic sites, these internships are usually unpaid. And being an architect in your early career is very financially challenging. And that is a key reason why architecture is one of those professions that is predominantly white, in addition to being a traditionally male profession. It's simply because people of color are less likely to have the ability to take these unpaid internships and have less of an ability to work for a very low wage for the first several years of their career after coming out of school. But there are some key differences. So architects, for instance, rarely get master's degrees. So you can get a master's degree, but most architects have a bachelor's degree, and then they simply go into the workforce. So you start as an intern and become a draftsman, or today, these days, most often beginning architects have the position of designer. And this is really the paying your dues period. So once you become a draftsman or a designer, you're really working for a firm, you're working for someone else. And this is where things are really rough as an architect. You're often working more than 65 hours a week. The pay is very terrible, and you're sort of barely getting by, especially these days with student loans. Many who go into the architecture profession find that this is the tough period. So if you make it through this period and you achieve the next stage, which is becoming a project manager, that's typically where you start to see stability. So in the next stage, becoming a project manager, you can see here in the top right of this timeline, this is when you start to gain managerial experience. You start to get involved in professional associations. In the field of architecture, that's usually the American Institute of Architects or the AIA. And this is where you start to earn a stable income. It's not necessarily lucrative, but it is stable. And then, some people never go beyond a project manager role, but many do and become principals in their firms. They either start their own firm or they become a part owner or a principal in a larger firm. So principals usually have a share or a board seat in an architecture firm. There are for-profit companies, so they usually have some level of governance over the company itself. And they supervise everyone in their department or on the project team. They work directly with clients, and there's a lot of money invested in their professional development. So as principals, firms send them to conferences, invest in them, going to take continuing education classes so that they can keep certified. And this is well beyond the point where they've become a registered architect or an RA. And so to keep their license, which is distributed by a government agency, in this case, the state, they do have to keep going to continuing education classes to show that they're aware of changes in building code, etc. And it's really at this principal stage that they make a good living. We'll talk more about the salary differences in a bit. So compared to architecture, urban planning is quite different and aligns a little more closely with what we do in preservation. So the key difference between planners and preservationists is that, like architects, they also have a sense of what they would like to do as they enroll in college. So many of them, before going to college, choose the major of architecture or engineering. Sometimes it's anthropology, but generally the sort of common thread between urban planners is that they know they're interested in architecture and they want to pursue something aligned with it, but then they begin studying architecture and they often find that it's not for them, that they're more interested in the human side of things or in policy than they are in the math and the sort of logistical side of the architectural and engineering world. And so many of them begin in the architecture track and then end up changing their majors. So many urban planners graduate with a bachelor's degree in urban studies. Some complete a bachelor's degree in architecture and then go and get a master's. But almost all urban planners immediately get a master's degree after they get a bachelor's. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch in that profession. Most do an internship while they're in school, getting their master's degree, but some don't do an internship until after. And it's sort of from the internship on that planners are very different from both architects and preservationists. Most planners end up working in government roles, and the sort of career trajectory as an urban planner is very stable. It's not necessarily financially lucrative, but it is very stable. So from the beginning, they get paid. So usually internships in urban planning are paid internships. It's very rare that you find an unpaid internship. The difference might be if you go to do an internship with a nonprofit organization that does community development work or some sort of community-oriented design, and you get an unpaid internship. But most planners do their internships in government agencies, and those are very often paid. They're not well paid, but they're still paid. And then they go into their entry planning positions. So these positions usually come with some sort of investment in their career from the very beginning. So most planning departments in at least medium to large size cities have multiple planning staff and offer entry-level positions. And those staff members are usually given an allowance for professional development. So from the beginning, planners can choose to spend that money to go to an annual conference. In this case, they join the American Planning Association or go to the APA, which is what it's called, conference. The National Planning Conference is what they call their conference. So those professionals from the beginning have a trajectory to engage with career development. And once they get into their mid-career, they usually become an advanced planner, sometimes also called an associate planner. And those individuals are sort of in the mid-career stage. Many planners never go beyond those roles. Those are very stable jobs. They pay fairly well. They come with career development. But if someone is interested in going beyond that role, they often can get AICP certified, and that's a certification that's distributed and managed by the APA, the American Planning Association. So planners report to APA and take classes through APA or other classes that are certified by APA so that they can keep their AICP certification. And once they're certified, that sort of opens a gateway for them to go beyond and go the next level. And that's when they can become a senior planner. So many who get AICP certified become a senior planner and sort of cap out at senior planner status. And then following senior planners, some of them become department managers. So they'll be a head of planning department. But the key sort of thing that you may notice here is that many of these positions are in government. So most urban planners work in government positions. There are for-profit consulting firms. There are a number of large ones throughout the country that work on a regional and national scale that hire. But even within those firms, the trajectory is kind of similar to this. And then in some cases, they become a principal similar to an architecture firm. But for most planners, they sort of stay on this trajectory and work in government. And that's because it really comes with so much stability. And at the end, they get to retire. So that's kind of the key difference here between this profession and ours, is that at the end, they get to retire and there's some stability on a long-term basis. So now going to us, we are pretty unique in this, realm of preservation. So first, one of the key differences is that we do not know, in most cases, that historic preservation is a profession before we go to college. Very few people know that preservation is a career path in the public realm, and they don't necessarily tell their children that they can pursue a degree in historic preservation because they simply don't know that it exists. So most preservationists go to college to study something else before discovering the field. So that's where we're a little backwards. Now, the thing that's great about this, and that we tend to get lucky on, is that most of us are passionate about history by default. That's what draws us to the field. So many of us get degrees in history or get degrees in fields like art history, as I did, anthropology, etc. And those professions or those degrees sort of work well as a gateway into preservation practices. So that's sort of by happenstance, but it is fortunate. So many of us go to college and study something that is not historic preservation but aligns well. For those few who are lucky enough to understand that preservation exists before they go to college, there are undergraduate programs in preservation. They just are not very common. Then we discover preservation. So most people, we'll send out a poll here if you'd like to respond to the poll. Most people in the field of preservation learn that they are able to pursue this as a career path when they're in their early sort of to mid-20s, is what we found by doing research. So already here I'm seeing some feedback from those of you who are participating in the webinar. It looks like more than half so far, almost 60% have said that you learned about preservation as a field when you were in your early 20s. And we are finding that that is common. So many of us hear about this when we are in that early stage of our career. So we've already gotten our degree, but we haven't quite decided what we're going to do. Someone tells us about preservation, and then we realize it's a career path and we go to grad school. So that's usually how that works out. So we go to grad school, you can earn a master's degree in historic preservation. So there's an MHP, a Master of Historic Preservation. Some schools, which tend to be more on the side of studying materials and science, offer an MS in historic preservation. Those tend to be more technical programs. Or you can get a Master's of Heritage Conservation, an MHC, which is what I hold from the University of Southern California. They're one of the few programs in the United States that offers that specific degree, but there are a couple of them out there. So those, all of them are generally very similar. So the sort of career path here is you go to grad school, get your degree. And then afterwards, you tend to start by getting an internship or getting some sort of preliminary experience that helps you choose your brand of preservation. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but the key thing to note with internships in our field is that they're usually unpaid. Many of them are with nonprofit organizations, and if they are paid, they're usually with consulting firms or government agencies, sort of along the same track as urban planners. And so that is where we tend to align with planners if you go down that trajectory. But if you do choose to get involved in nonprofits, there are a few different ways that you can go about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit here about the different types of preservation and the different brands of preservation. So to start, there's the opportunity to get involved in preservation through a Main Street organization or advocacy. So Main Street organizations tend to be aligned with economic development, and they often are responsible for facilitating and distributing tax credits and easements, which govern how and when people modify their historic properties and also play a role in protecting historic properties. Just because we're not getting too deep in the weeds on how preservation works today, I won't go in depth with those, but I will say that I'm going to cover some resources at the end that you can use to learn more about Main Street programs and that general branch of preservation. You can also get into advocacy through nonprofit groups, and these are the groups that fight for historic places. Sometimes they're filing lawsuits. Other times they're out there, just rallying community members to express their love or desire to save a historic place. So these are often community organizing groups. So with these career paths, if you get involved in either one of these, usually they're local or statewide organizations. As I mentioned, these usually start with unpaid internships, but occasionally those lead to staff positions. And I should note an important asterisk here is that that's for organizations that pay. So many of these organizations are run entirely by volunteers. So in this case, I'm not talking about those organizations. I'm talking about organizations that hire staff, to be more specific. And those organizations that do hire staff typically pay on the lower end of the spectrum in this profession. So if you choose one of these career paths, these are usually careers that people pursue because they're very passionate about the topic and it's very important to them, not because they're looking to make a very strong salary. So in most cases, you will not achieve a six-figure salary working in this realm of preservation. These individuals typically join our professional association, which for preservationists these days is primarily, but not always, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And they attend conferences on behalf of their organizations, which is sort of how they engage with career development. And then sort of last, they work their way up to executive director. So many who run these organizations or work in these organizations as staff sort of build up, they become program officers or administrators, and then sort of deputy directors, and then eventually become executive directors. And as an executive director, that's when you can sort of hop your way from small to large organizations. You can start with a local organization and then become the executive director of a regional and then maybe a statewide. And so if you have big ambitions, that's a way that you can really build your career in this branch, but you can also really build your salary. So those who become executive directors of larger organizations, statewide organizations, do often end up in the six-figure salary range, depending on the state that they're representing and how large the cities are there. So it depends on where you are, but there are opportunities for a good living in this trajectory. Sort of a next branch here is consulting. So there's a whole for-profit consulting arm of the preservation world. And these individuals tend to be responsible for evaluating historic properties. So they're often hired by government agencies and private property owners. Those are usually their clients. And they're hired to do surveys where they evaluate historic properties and help identify what properties in a certain area might be eligible to be historic landmarks or to be protected through historic preservation policies. They also advise on historic properties, so they might create a plan for how a historic property should be treated as a large building is built next to it or as it's renovated. And these groups are usually working on a larger scale. So often there are large firms who work on a regional or national level. Even independent consultants can work on regional or national levels in preservation consulting. So many are working beyond just the local level. These are also the most stable of careers. They usually begin with paid positions, which lead to staff positions, sort of aligns more with a architecture background where they sort of become mid-level staff, and then you can stay there and earn a decent living, or you become a principal in the firm, you can become part owner, and you can make a pretty solid salary working in consulting as a principal. These individuals participate in career development by going to conferences. Depends on what they do in their firm. Some go to the National Trust for Historic Preservation Conference, which is called Pass Forward and tends to be looking at themes within the profession. But many focus more on architecture and sort of technical backgrounds because they focus more on that in their work. And so they tend to be less focused on the trajectory of preservation as a movement and as a field. And many go to conferences like the Doco-Momo conference, the documentation of the conservation of the modern movement, which tends to be more focused on architecture. They'll go to the Association for Preservation Technology conference, APT, which I'll talk about more. And then they sort of work their way, as I mentioned, to becoming a principal. Our next career path here are government and construction. So there's a couple other ones here that you can follow. Government career paths in preservation are strong, and there are a lot of jobs in government. So it's definitely something where there's stability that you can find. This usually ends up following the same trajectory as urban planning. So I'll allow you to sort of look back there. And urban planners tend to, or preservationists who go down this road tend to work in planning departments, and their job titles are often planner. So they're not necessarily distinguished on paper from a normal urban planner that didn't get a degree in preservation, but they tend to get tasked with doing things like enforcing codes and developing guidelines that impact historic properties. But again, this leads to a stable career trajectory, usually with pretty solid pay that can lead to a retirement track. And then sort of the last option here is construction or restoration. So these folks are a lot more scientific. This tends to be a lot more specific or niche as a career path. And these individuals work either for themselves, or they start their own small company, or they can work for a large construction or restoration company. They're hired by nonprofits that own historic properties or manage easements on historic properties, real estate developers who are tasked with renovating a historic property, or property owners who own a historic property and would like to renovate it. So they tend to have different clientele than the rest of the profession. They're also pretty different in a couple of ways. So first, master's degrees are not necessarily required to do this work. So some people do get them, but it's not needed. And that's something to think about if this is the trajectory you'd like to go down and how you would like to do that. You really can learn on the job. And I say that as someone whose background is in this realm of the preservation world. Second, your work can be very physical. So some people end up being the physical laborers in their construction work. They do specialty restoration work. They'll, lay plaster and paint and do restoration, or they end up managing. So in my role, I've been a construction manager, and I end up managing these projects. These individuals typically are members of the Association for Preservation Technology, which I mentioned before, APT. And they typically, if they go to a conference, they typically go to the APT conferences, which tend to be a little bit more focused on materials. But again, it's important to know that there are so many other tracks that you can go down. In preservation, there really are a lot of different avenues. There's cultural institutions like museums. You can become a professor and work in higher education. Historic house museums sometimes have paid staff, although that tends to be less common. Urban design work is sort of a cross between planning and architecture that sometimes can be open to people with a preservation background. And then you can even get into law and do historic preservation law, which tends to be allocated under land use law. So there really are a lot of opportunities to get engaged in this profession. So sort of looking at how we compare with other fields is key. So first, we compare by sort of some key differences in terms of certification. So under general points here on the left, you can see that preservation doesn't have any mainstream certifications, which means that people are less inclined to go to conferences or participate in professional training. In our case, many of us do this because we feel we would like to for our own professional development. That may be the reason you are listening to this webinar right now. But in other fields like planning or architecture, individuals go to APA or AIA conferences because it's required to get credits so that they can maintain their certifications. And in order to get those credits, the easiest and most cost-efficient way is to just go to the conference. So that's why many employers in those fields pay for their staff to go to those conferences. That's pretty different from preservation, where we often don't see employers who pay for preservation staff to go to conferences. Sometimes they do if you are a key figure in an organization and they would like you to be represented within the conference, but it's very rare that a firm will pay for all of their staff to go because there's not a requirement for them to upkeep a certification. In terms of salary, we tend to measure up pretty fairly. We're kind of in the same range here, actually. So architects tend to earn a little higher on the high end of the spectrum, grossing on average on high end for a principal a little over $100,000 a year. So they do sort of break the six-figure mark. But planners and preservationists tend to be on a similar trajectory on the high and low end. The difference is that planners tend to have more stability and often have a career track that leads to retirement and sort of a pension benefit on the long term, versus preservationists tend to be responsible for managing and planning for their own retirement. So that's kind of a key difference between our two fields. Architects, like preservationists, don't often get a pension and don't get to retire unless it's of their own planning. So that's something that distinguishes them from urban planners. Now, the thing to consider here is that in terms of salary, there are absolutely high-end and low-end outliers as well. So on the low end of preservation, there are people who make nothing. They work full-time as professionals, essentially as a hobby. They volunteer as preservationists. Many of those would not fall into the bracket of professional preservationists, but some of them do work full-time with no pay or very, very low pay. So you might see people who run a preservation organization and work full-time who make $15,000 or $10,000 a year, which obviously is not a living wage. So those are people who are subsidized or can afford to work for a very low wage. On the high end, though, those who run larger organizations or are principals with larger for-profit companies in the field can gross, over $100,000 a year, and in some cases can gross close to $500,000 a year, depending on the profession and the organization they represent. So, at the largest level of nonprofit organizations in the country, people can make, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year working as an executive director. So that's not to say that all preservation professionals cap out at $80,000 a year. There absolutely are positions that pay more. So the highlight reel here is that there are a lot of great things about working in preservation. If you're considering a career in this field, there are a lot of really high moments working in it. So, essentially the key and sort of the greatest benefit of working in this field is the experience of working with communities and seeing the impact of your work and how it comes to fruition. So when you're working with a community to save a historic place, seeing that effort manifest in the actual saving of that place, it can be really rewarding. There really is nothing like it. And just speaking as someone who was responsible for doing a high-profile project, in my case, saving and relocating the world's first Taco Bell a few years ago, I can say that doing that project was really rewarding for me. And as a, sort of component of my career trajectory, it did a lot for me in connecting me with different organizations. And, I really experienced a benefit from doing that project that showcases how much doing this work can end up being an important sort of factor in your own professional development and experience and reputation. It also can provide a career path that gives you a pretty decent living while allowing you to do something you really care about. So if you're very interested in history, you care a lot about telling stories, not necessarily even just architecture, but working with communities and telling their stories, this is a career path that can provide you with a stable living and allow you to pursue that interest. And then the last, The different sort of brands of preservation allow for a lot of stability while you're in your working years. So not necessarily afterwards when you're looking for retirement benefits, but in the sort of working years of your life, if you fall on hard times or there's a dip in the economy, there's always a different form of preservation to pursue, which can be a really large benefit. So, if you're working in a nonprofit environment and your position becomes eliminated, then you can pursue a career in consulting. Or if you're working in consulting, you decide it's not right for you, there's government work, or there are nonprofit and organizations to turn to. There is such a wide range of work in preservation that there really is always something that you can turn to. There's always a need for positions, especially when it comes to government agencies. If you're interested and willing to do the work, agencies like FEMA, which manage disaster relief and disaster aid, always need staff. And frankly, as climate change becomes a bigger issue in this country, FEMA positions will continue to grow, and historic preservationists will be in higher demand as areas that have a large stock of historic buildings face climate-related disasters, wildfires, and sea level rise and other challenges. FEMA is working to survey those sites, survey those areas, and to do disaster relief, which involves obviously renovating and doing improvements to historic properties that have been damaged. So they often have positions where a preservationist can be sort of placed on duty in a specific area to work with a community. But there are obviously areas where preservation can improve. First, our profession is very homogenous. So it's overwhelmingly white as an industry and as a field. So we have a lot of work to do in that regard, and we have been making a lot of improvement. And we're not the only ones who have this challenge. Architecture, real estate development, urban planning are all largely white professions, although planning and preservation these days are starting to become more diverse because we, within those professions, tend to touch on the stories and personal experiences of people who live in diverse communities. And so we've started to attract a more diverse base of professionals, which is great for our field. As far as being a young person in the field, it can be uncomfortable. Last year, we at Tico did a market research survey. We interviewed over 100 professionals who worked in fields focused on the built environment, many of them preservationists. And the third most common reason they said they were hesitant to engage with conferences and other forms of professional development is because they felt unwelcome, either because of the lack of diversity or because of the lack of people in their age bracket. And so that can be very intimidating as a young person to go to a conference not knowing anyone, not seeing any people who are your own age, and in preservation, which is a largely older profession with a base of practitioners who are 40 plus, it tends to be challenging if you are in your teens or 20s to show up and keep coming to events without finding that sense of camaraderie. That's not to say that those who are in their 40s and 50s are still, in some cases, in the early stages of their career, but with the generational gap and experience these days due to technology, there's just a very large difference in opinion and experience that comes to the table. And last, the shift in preservation is still happening. So if you've been involved in the preservation community for a while, you are aware that preservation traditionally focuses on architecture and buildings. These days, there's a big movement in preservation to sort of shift the conversation to focus on people and places, which don't necessarily always require the existence of a building, and often touch on sort of the more artistic form of storytelling. And so right now, we as a profession are sort of in the midst of an identity crisis where some are practicing a certain form of preservation or have a certain perception of what preservation means, and others have a more sort of new age perspective on it, and not all of them are coming to the table. So you will sometimes see at conferences and different organizations that things feel a bit disjointed. And last, the lack of collaboration between preservation and adjacent professions is really severe. So in my opinion, this is one of the biggest challenges we face as a field, is that we don't often work with professionals in fields like real estate development, architecture, planning. What has happened over the last 50 years or so is that these professionals have started to see us as cumbersome or as people who need to be avoided and not people who need to be worked with. And that can be a big challenge because, you know, if you're trying to save a historic place, which is owned by a real estate developer, they don't take you seriously, you're not going to make very much headway with them. Or if you're trying to convince your government agency to implement a historic preservation ordinance, but your staff in your planning department doesn't understand why preservation should be taken seriously, and they were taught in school that preservationists are, you know, problematic and should be avoided, you're not going to make very much headway there. So we as a profession have a long way to go in terms of collaboration, and there is absolutely room for improvement in this regard. So there's a few things that I think are really important to think about before you choose to pursue a career in preservation. I'm just going to talk about a few of these. You can read all of them here on the screen while I'm talking, obviously, but I'm just going to cover a few key ones. So starting in the top left, your brand of preservation is really important. If you know after you've started your master's degree program that you're not interested in a specific type of preservation, then you should listen to that. If you're finding yourself not interested in certain classes, doing certain types of activities, you should pay attention to that interest and where you're falling in your interest areas, because that ends up determining who you are, who you're going to be working with as you go forward in your career and what kind of work you'll do. And if you have an opportunity to identify your interest area or your brand of preservation early, that's a huge leg up in your career, because as you go forward, you can be thinking about who are the professionals that I will need to collaborate with, right? If you're interested in construction, you could be thinking about who your clients will be. Your clients will be real estate developers, government agencies, and property owners. So you might be thinking, okay, what do I need to learn, or how do they work so that I can be getting ready to have them as clients? So if you are interested in doing an educational work, you may be thinking you want to work for a nonprofit, and then it might be helpful to study nonprofit management and get an understanding of how nonprofits are structured, how they work, really getting a sense of the different organizations and the different companies that are out there who could be your clients or who might employ you, and their structure and their processes is really key. And if you understand that early, it can be a very big asset for you going forward. So the second thing I want to cover is this left middle bullet point here. Do you need a master's degree? That's something really to think about in this profession specifically. If you go down the construction path, you do not need a master's degree to be able to do that practice. You can learn by doing. And even there are many pathways that you can go down to do that and to learn by doing. You can even get involved in groups like Habitat for Humanity just to learn basic construction skills. There are trade organizations that teach hard skills that you can use to learn how to do restoration work. You can just right off the bat get hired and go work with a construction company. I, for instance, when I was interested in doing construction, went and did some volunteer work doing construction and careful restoration work on a historic house museum. So there are often opportunities to do that kind of work, and then you can learn by doing. And it's sort of like doing an apprenticeship. In some cases, you can get paid to go do that work early, and you don't need to rack up the debt to get a master's degree. Now, the other thing is, if you are not interested in the construction side of things and you do want to do consulting work, nonprofit work, advocacy, in many cases, you do need a master's degree. The National Park Service is sort of our key agency that oversees the practice. The Department of the Interior, National Park Service, oversees the practice of preservation on a national scale. And there are sort of requirements under the Secretary of the Interior standards, which is something I won't go into today. But again, I'll reference that when I mention resources at the end. There are a list of requirements that tell you what you need to practice. And 15 years of experience gets you the ability to practice independently as a preservation consultant under those requirements. But if you don't have the time to get that 15 years of experience, a master's degree is certainly faster. So you can pay, you can go to school, get a degree. But one thing to think about if you're choosing a degree program in preservation is you should not choose a program based on name or prestige in this field, in my opinion, just because in this field specifically, there really isn't an old boys club or the kind of concept that if you go to a specific degree program, you are more likely to get a certain kind of job. You can get a job doing any of the brands of preservation with a degree from any of the preservation programs. So don't get yourself in debt to go to an Ivy League university or to go to a really elite school to study preservation if you're worried about it just because of a name. Really, you can get a good quality education going to a state school in your own area if they have a preservation program, and you can, go through that program and come out the other side with very little student debt and then work your way through it. Just speaking as someone that went to an expensive school and has a lot of student debt, I chose the school I chose because I felt the mentality of the program was the right fit for me. That's something that's really important to think about is, what kind of preservation do you want to practice, and is that school the right fit for you? But, if you don't have to be in a position where you're taking out a lot of loans, then don't put yourself in that position necessarily. So at the top right, where would you like to work? Be thinking about that before you choose your degree program if you get a chance. So physically, the location of where you want to live and work can make a really big difference in the nature of your preservation career. That depends on, again, what kind of preservation you want to practice or your brand of preservation. If you work in construction, you may want to be thinking about where you're going to be based. There are a lot of areas where there are historic resources, but not a lot of money to invest in the rehabilitation of those resources. So there's not as much work if you're in construction. If you're in construction, there's a lot more money to be based in areas where there's an affluent population that renovates larger or high profile historic resources, and big companies that do that work. So that's something to think about. If you're doing consulting work, areas like the West Coast are really big right now because those are areas that have never been surveyed historically, and government agencies are now starting to realize that the building stock is getting fairly old and needs to be surveyed. So there's a lot of surveying work and assessment work available to consultants on the West Coast right now. So it sort of depends on where you would like to be and how that plays into your decision. And then last, at the bottom right here, I'll talk a little bit about how you can network and meet the people you need to know as you go forward. That's super important, is really building relationships. Preservation is one of those fields where everyone knows each other. It's such a small community where having strong relationships can do wonders for your career path and can connect you with the people you need to know. And it's not always expensive to get those experiences. So you can network by going to happy hours. You can sign up for the e-newsletters for your local or statewide historic preservation group. You can find out when they're having a conference or when they are having an event. You can go to happy hours for your local AIA chapter, APA chapter, if you sign up for their newsletter, and find out when those are happening. In most cases, you do not need to be a member to go to happy hours. You can show up, get a beer, talk to other people, and really get comfortable with people who are working in your area, ask questions, etc. Also, just by subscribing to their newsletters, you can get a sense of what's happening in your area, and that can be really helpful to get a sense of who's working in those areas. You can see who the sponsors are of those organizations and see who might be hiring. Oftentimes, they'll post open career positions in those newsletters. So that's really a huge resource for you. And then LinkedIn or online networking sites are really helpful. LinkedIn in particular for a field like preservation that's very specialized, also architecture and urban planning, is not necessarily a huge asset. It's some place where you can have your resume listed if you're looking for a job. It can be helpful, but in general, our work is so specialized that using LinkedIn can actually be more cumbersome than helpful. And that is where Tico comes into play. And I'm going to take just a quick minute to talk about the work we're doing at Tico and give you a sense of how this can be helpful if you're networking as a preservation professional or building your career in preservation. So Tico is a community for early career professionals who are working to improve their community, their city, and the built environment as a whole. So our members are people in every profession, from historic preservation to architects. There are street artists and muralists. There are landscape architects. They are urban planners. And, we have a very wide range of professionals on Tico who come from different backgrounds. And in preservation, this kind of specific networking is really key, because it's these people who are the ones that you end up needing to know as you go forward in your career path, who share your experience. And the thing that's really key about Tico is that all people on this platform have between 2 and 15 years of experience. So it's something where you can meet people who not only work in your same industry and care about the same things you care about and share your interests and concerns, but you can also find them in a window where they're experiencing the same things you are. They're also in the early stages of their career and are going through sort of similar challenges and have similar thoughts that you can discuss together. So on Tico, you have the ability to connect with professionals who work in preservation and a wide range of professions who share your interests. So when you're searching for people on Tico, if you're searching on LinkedIn, you can type in preservationists and you'll get people who have typed in preservation somewhere on their profile. But LinkedIn doesn't really know what you mean when you type that in. They're not specific to preservation with over 400 million people on the platform. So, it's very broad and very difficult to see through the literally hundreds of thousands of results to find the right people for you. On Tico, you can type in preservationist or preservation, and you can see architects who care about preservation or specialize in preservation. You can see construction workers, you can see marketing professionals that work in preservation professionals who share your interests, and you can even filter by people who are also interested in graphic design, who are also interested in bicycling and pedestrian issues, who are interested in murals and historical zoning practices. So we have a wide range of things that allow you to connect with people that you have something in common with. Members also get to decide what we talk about on Tico. So there are discussions on Tico. We post new ones multiple times a week. So members submit topics that they would like to talk about with the community. These can be relating to building your career, practical knowledge about the specific career that you are in and the field you're in, like preservation, and also general big picture questions related to our practice and how we go about doing our work. And then last, you can also gain access to in-person events. So Tico hosts gatherings around the country that are limited to less than 100 people and are designed to bring people together who share interests across professions. So our next retreat is going to be taking place this fall in Detroit, and that'll be open to people from throughout the Rust Belt region. So we're going to be inviting people from states like Ohio, areas like Buffalo and Philadelphia to come together in Detroit over the course of 2 days to talk about how they're doing their work in the built environment, to meet people who share their interests, and to really explore the big challenges facing that region today. And I'll just note that at the bottom right here, there's a code that you can use if you decide you'd like to join Tico. A membership to Tico is $10 a month. You can get your first month on us if you use code Heritage Ohio, just as a thank you for participating in today's webinar by the end of next month. So real quick here, I want to go ahead and dive into the sort of other side of professional development. So in addition to networking and online networking, things that you would get through a company like LinkedIn or Tico, you can also access career development through professional organizations. So I've listed off, I won't go into detail here on all of these, you can obviously see them here, but I've listed off some of the bigger players in our field and how you can get involved with them or how they work. So sort of the key ones under historic preservation are the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is a hybrid of an advocacy organization that fights for historic places and a historic preservation professional organization that offers career development. So as I mentioned, preservation does not have a certification. There is no license to practice preservation technically. So we don't really have a sort of traditional practicing professional organization. So the National Trust is kind of the biggest thing that we have in that realm, and they're sort of the key go-to place for professional development. But the other large ones who sort of are in this field are APT. They have their own conference, and they tend to be geared towards people working with materials or construction. Preservation Action, which tends to be, is very advocacy oriented. So you can join Preservation Action and go to their conference and work on legislation and lobbying. And then if you're involved in government, the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions is really helpful. And if you're interested in more of the storytelling component of preservation, NCPH, or the National Council on Public History, is a really excellent resource. They put on an amazing conference every year. I highly recommend it, along with Pass Forward by the National Trust. And then, really don't rule out the possibility of getting involved in some of these intersecting organizations, primarily APA. The American Planning Association is sort of the biggest counterpart to preservation, and they do have certification, AICP certification, which can be really useful. A lot of preservation professionals who focus on sustainability and construction do choose to also get LEED certified through the USGBC, the US Green Building Council. And really, they just do LEED. So their big thing is LEED certification. They take applications for buildings to get LEED certified, which indicates how environmentally sustainable a building really is, et cetera. And then the AIA offers allied membership. So you don't have to be an architect to be a member of the AIA. You can become an allied member for a lower rate. You can still attend the AIA conference. And then ULI, the Urban Land Institute, and CNU, the Congress for the New Urbanism, both really play into real estate development. And last here, I, again, won't go over every single one of these in detail, but just briefly, know that there are other online communities you can turn to for a more specific to preservation experience. So if you're not interested in something that's a little more broad like Tico, you can turn to the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Forum Connect, which is preservation specific and is really like a Q&A format. So unlike Tico, which is more of a social network, Forum Connect is more of a forum where it's just a Q&A. You can ask for career advice, you can ask a question, you can ask for a recommendation of a resource, and someone in the preservation field will respond to you. It's pretty helpful. There's also historic preservation professionals on Facebook. That's kind of a key place to turn to if you have questions or want career advice. If you are a podcast listener, there's a couple of great podcasts out there where they interview practitioners, and you can hear how people discovered preservation and tips based on the kind of work that they do. And sort of lastly, I'll just say I won't really dive into these conferences here, but do get out there, do go to conferences. There are definitely ways to make conferences affordable. Some of them are quite expensive, but if you apply to be a speaker and you're presenting at a conference, some of them will give you free registration. So definitely keep an eye out. Make sure you're on their e-newsletter list so you get notified when they are accepting proposals for a conference session, so you can try to get a conference session accepted and go for free. If they don't offer a free registration for speakers, they often have a discount. There's also scholarships. If you're a current student, there are scholarships you can use to go to conferences, some of which will pay for your travel as well, and some of which include accommodations if the conference is happening outside of your area. And definitely be on top of it. Don't miss early bird registration and end up paying hundreds more dollars than you need to register. And there are definitely ways you can swing it. If you're on a tight budget when you're going to a conference, you can crash with a friend and split a hotel room if you're going out of town. You can carpool if it's within a drive, and try to save some dollars instead of going on a flight. Whatever is more affordable, and obviously depending on where the conference is taking place, you can definitely make this work for your budget. And then in terms of more learning, there are resources here. You can go to any of these 3 websites that are listed, and you can access more information on how to pursue a career in preservation. You can see lists of degree programs at NCPE and the National Council for Preservation Education.org. And all of those can be really helpful to give more detail on what I've covered here and to provide additional insight on preservation as a whole and sort of the movement. So with that being said, that's everything I have here. I think we're going to take some questions. So I will hand it over to Joyce to read out some of the questions we've gotten from attendees over the course of the webinar, and we'll see if we can get you guys some helpful answers.
Thank you, Katie. That's a lot of information in 60 minutes. Please type in any questions you have, and I'll be happy to read those out. The first question is, will a copy of this PowerPoint be available online? Well, actually, Megan, the recording will automatically be sent to you if you attended the webinar or registered for the webinar, and I can send you a copy of the PowerPoint. After a few months, we do post our webinars on our Heritage Ohio YouTube channel. Are there any other questions?
I know this is quite a bit of information, considering all the different things that go into pursuing a career in preservation. So I definitely wanted to touch on some key points here, but I know as far as preservation as a practice, I didn't get into that much. If you have questions about anything I've talked about or any other things that sort of intersect with preservation, we're more than happy to answer them. Either myself or Joyce, I'm sure, can dive into those to be helpful.
And this is not a questiony audience. You can always, again, type in questions later. I want to thank everyone for attending the webinar today. Like I said, oh, there's a question that came in. Would Tico be helpful for someone older as well as the younger people?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's actually one I get quite a bit. So Tico, a really important aspect of Tico is that we don't have an age cap. We have an experience cap. So those with between 2 and 15 years of experience are welcome to join Tico. But we have quite a few people who have joined Tico who have changed professions later in life. So for instance, maybe they were an architect and then they became a historic preservationist in their profession. Or, I know someone who used to be an investment banker and then became a historic preservationist in their mid-50s. So there are quite a few people in the Tico community who are on the older end of the spectrum. Our average age of a member is 37. So our members are not all 20-somethings and college students. Many of our members are not even students, although we do have some who are currently getting their degrees. But yeah, that's an excellent question. I would say it's still very much helpful for those who are in their later years who are working in the field. I think the key thing that ties Tico members together is that they are bringing a new perspective to the practice, right? They have not been in this practice for 30 years. They have a new take on how we do our work in preservation. And that is really the benefit of Tico, is being able to bring together people who have a fresh take on our work, who are exploring new trends and new ideas in the built environment, and to give them a platform to be able to talk about that together. So we have found that those who are in their later years, who joined the profession later or who switched professions, are still getting quite a lot out of it.
Okay, we had a couple of other questions come in. What advice can be used in working with older, more entrenched organizations and community leaders who are resistant or resentful to younger professionals?
Yeah, that is such a tough one. As I mentioned, I personally have faced a lot of backlash from more established and more entrenched, as a nice word to use, organizations and individuals working in preservation. I will say that, there are just some instances where not everyone is going to agree. You're not always going to get everyone on the same page. But I think there are a couple of things that I like to remember that could be helpful for you. So first, I always say that you should lead by example. So if you want them to be practicing in a certain way, or you want them to see the value in doing things a certain way, you should lead by doing that work the best you can without the support system, and show them what is possible when they come around. And I can say from my own experience, that does work. The other thing, though, is to consider that there are some places you don't need to meet people. So I think in some cases, I've seen organizations that are practicing racial discrimination and are, so entrenched in a certain practice that it becomes problematic in a very serious way. And in that case, finding a partner that is not that organization that can come to them, who they preferably have some sort of reference for, who can explain to them that that practice is wrong and that they need to be thinking about different leadership or thinking about a different way of doing things, can be helpful. But again, that sort of critique or feedback is received most positively, in my experience, by other organizations that they're already working with or that they have a long-standing friendship with, and not coming from an outsider. So if you can get someone who's on the inside to really stick their neck out and say, hey, you know, we need to be doing things differently, that goes a long way. But first and foremost, in my experience, leading by example is really key. And it does take time and it does take patience, but you can get people to come around and start practicing differently. I've seen it. I've been a part of making it happen. And when you do see it happen, it's very rewarding.
Oh, we have another comment that says, please mention the National Register and National Park Service and the opportunities and resources available.
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. And I really do want to point this out. So kind of within the realm of government jobs, and also resources. So first, the National Park Service, as I mentioned, is the administrator of historic preservation under the Department of the Interior on the national level. They work with state historic preservation officers, or SHPOs, as you might hear them called, to sort of create resources and implement programs and policies on a statewide and even regional basis. So definitely looking into NPS.gov and looking into the resources they have. They have a series called Bulletins, and you can look at bulletins posted by the Department of the Interior to get a sense of how preservation is practiced. Those are fascinating. Many of them are being updated now after decades of use, so it's good to be able to see them becoming more relevant to how we practice today. But I'll also say, in terms of jobs, people often forget that there are plenty of jobs in historic preservation in national parks. So with a degree in historic preservation, you can work as staff in a national monument, national parks, in state parks. There are interpretive roles where you can literally dress up as people from a time period and do interpretive, sort of dramatic engagement with visitors at national historic sites or historic sites in general. But there are also roles where you can be administrative, you can do construction or conservation or restoration type work in those roles. There is so much there, and they're excellent paying jobs that come with benefits. And we actually are in a shortage of park rangers right now on a national basis. So there are a lot of vacancies in park ranger jobs. If you are willing to sort of live a nomadic lifestyle and live off the grid with the National Park Service in a national park, there are a lot of job opportunities for you. And even if you're not willing to do that, but you would simply like to be a park ranger in a park that is rather close to where you live or a decent drive away, there are a lot of open positions right now that people with historic preservation degrees can fill. So definitely an important one to think
about. Okay. We have a few more comments. One, will you be sending a list of these groups and organizations for reference? Well, one, you will get the webinar sent to you, and I'm happy to send you a copy of the PowerPoint that lists those organizations. If there's something else, please let us know. The next question, what brand of preservation would you think has the most opportunity for career development in this identity crisis changing industry era?
I would say that you are the safest if you're looking for stability, or you're looking for an employer that's going to invest in you. You are the safest pursuing a position in government. So if you go sort of the urban planning track where you're aligned with planners, you're working in a planning department in a government agency, those jobs tend to send you to conferences. They tend to pay for you to go through different training programs. They come with great benefits. They pay a stable salary. It's not necessarily a high salary, but it does pay a lot. That's not to say it's an easy 9 to 5 job where you clock in, you clock out. People who work in those departments tend to work long hours, or there's a lot of weekend obligations. So it is hard work, and it is very tenuous, working with communities and communicating with the public and maintaining relationships with those often entrenched preservation organizations. But there's a lot of opportunity there. Some of these cities, if you work in a bigger city, there's a great amount of opportunity. The city of Los Angeles, for instance, has over 300 employees in the planning department, and just in the historic preservation office alone has over 30 positions, and they're currently hiring for more people. So, something to think about in larger cities. There is a pretty sizable opportunity, but even if you go work in a smaller city, there's an opportunity, because planners in smaller communities where they might only have 2 or 3 people on a planning staff, often those planners are tasked with doing historic preservation work, and they need people who have this as a background, because if they don't, they're hiring planners who don't know historic preservation, and they're just trying to learn it on the fly. So if you apply for those positions and have a preservation background, that makes you a more desirable candidate.
Okay, thank you, Katie. I think that's the end of the questions for right now. Again, thank you for joining us. Tomorrow, all of the registrants will receive a copy of the recording. Next up on the Heritage Ohio calendar, July 10th, our next webinar is the Places You'll Go If Only You Can Find Your Way, which is a wayfinding webinar to be presented by Lauren Falcone. In August, we will be having another SASH Mob. This is a hands-on Windows workshop, learning how to rehabilitate Windows. That will be August 2nd and 3rd in Toledo. And keep in mind, the Heritage Ohio State Conference will be October 22nd and 23rd in Newark. And please check our website or Facebook to know what's going on with Heritage Ohio. And thank you very much for joining us.